Hello, I'm Rachael Geddes. I'm an autism practitioner for the Highland Council. I work as part of the Child Health and Disability team for Inverness and Badenoch and Strathspey. I also work as part of the training team for autism across Highlands.
My name's Sharon Morris. I'm an occupational therapist. I work in the Highland Council in an occupational therapy team there. I've done some close work with Rachael Geddes, autism practitioner, where we've co-worked, and particularly we've done some interventions that have included a sensory basis that have led to children feeling calmer and more organised and more able to achieve in different activities.
Today we're going to talk to you about the sensory world of autism from the perspective of a 15-year-old boy called Fred. Fred's a figment of my imagination, but he's obviously built up on the experience I've had with loads of kids across the years. Fred came about as part of my master's degree in autism with Birmingham University when I was asked, what's changed since you came into practice and how could you talk about it? So I came into practice in 1990 when I started training as a learning disability nurse. So obviously in 28 years, a huge amount has changed. But what was really prevalent to me was the addition of sensory systems into the diagnostic criteria for children with an autistic spectrum disorder. I'd first got passionate about this probably 5 years prior to doing this module, encouraged by my colleague Sharon Morris, who's also passionate about the sensory systems of kids on the spectrum. So when I started to think about what can I do for this module, I talked about the changes that had happened over the years, but I wanted to create something that was actually meaningful to the people that I worked with. Loads of the information you find about sensory systems for kids on the autistic spectrum uses massively big words and huge amounts of technology. And I can pick up some of those books and think, what on earth? So then when I was thinking about everybody else that also works in this field, I wanted to create something that was meaningful. And Fred was born. So Fred is a 15-year-old kid on the autistic spectrum. He's made up of loads of the kids that I've worked with over the years. So what I'm really conscious about when we talk about the sensory systems of children with autism is that people get themselves into a situation where they think that it's more complicated than it is. So from writing it from the perspective of a 15-year-old boy, I wanted to keep it really, really simple so that anybody, child or adult, could pick it up and have a really good, simple sense of how they could help that child. As I go around the Highlands, loads of professionals say to me that they need an OT, so that's an occupational therapist, to do a sensory profile of this child. And actually we don't. We just need people around that child who really know that child well to think about the different systems and to start to identify what sort of difficulties that child has. These things are also really prevalent in other neurodevelopmental conditions. So children with ADHD, children with dyspraxia, all have issues with their sensory systems. So it's starting to think that we can apply these systems in a really simple way to help the children that we're working directly with. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to look a little bit about the sensory systems. Some of them will be really, really familiar to you. There'll probably be a couple that aren't. We're going to look at how kids register sensory information, how it impacts on them, the sorts of things that make it worse, how we travel the road when we start to process sensory information. We're also going to look at how the sensory systems then impact on the anxiety levels of children. When I'm working with children on the autistic spectrum who have anxiety and have challenging behaviour, the first thing I start to look at nowadays is how they are processing sensory information, because this has a huge impact on how they manage the world around them. This is really important when we think about children that have shutdowns or meltdowns. We also need to start to be able to recognise when a child that we work with is having difficulties in those areas. And then we need to think about how we can proactively manage those sensory systems for children. I've had huge success in when I've started to look at putting sensory diets in place for children that their anxiety has gone down massively, which has then reduced their challenging behaviour. So this is incredibly important when we think about the overall management of children on the spectrum. Okay, so terms you will hear a lot of are things called hyper and hypo. So what we have is either a hyposensitivity to sensory information. So that's when we're not registering it at all. So a child that can't hear you when they're speaking to you, or a child that's not picking up on visual clues. Most of us are just in the just right section of managing our sensory systems. But then we also work with a huge amount of children who are hypersensitive to sensory information and become utterly and completely overwhelmed. And when this happens, their anxiety goes through the roof and they become unable to manage what's happening around them.
Rachael has just been talking about hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity. So quite often when people are talking about autism and sensory problems, people draw a lot of attention to hypersensitivity. So I'm going to give you an example. If somebody was going into a cafe and they were feeling hypersensitive, they might, before they open the door, be able to hear noise from in the cafe. As they push the door open, they maybe can feel a difference in temperature, and then they feel the smell, and the smell may have a really powerful effect on them. And then as they go through, they hear the till opening and it sounds a bit screechy. Someone is making a pen noise, and as they're hearing that, that's being uncomfortable to them because they can notice much more, and they're noticing all these things at once. So if this was the amount of sensory stimulation that was happening as they're going into the cafe, the person's pen, somebody even breathing they could be hearing, somebody coughing or choking, and all that was going into the head. If it was going in to somebody who was hypersensitive, who was very sensitive, then it would quickly begin to fill up their capacity to manage, because they've got so much going in all at once. Sometimes when I demonstrate this, I'll show that it overflows. On this instance, I can't because we've got electricity cables around, but this can easily go over the top. And having taken in all that sensory information, the person feels that they've had a lot of sensations before they've even found a place to go and sit down. On the other hand, one day somebody might be feeling that their sensory system is being hypo-responsive. So they might go into the canteen, somebody might walk past them, they might not even notice. The waiter may come and say hello, and they're not really noticing or responding. So we've got the same amount of sensory stimulation, but this child is not noticing as much. They might bump into the tables. They might enjoy that bump because it's giving them feedback. So they might go and pull a tablecloth or something. They may begin to hit themselves to get some sensation. They may bounce and jump. And when they sit down, they might be wriggling a lot and moving a lot, all trying to get information into their sensory system. And no matter how much information goes in, people are saying the name, people have maybe put something extra bright for them to look at, there's maybe really strong smells, they might not even notice a strong smell, and it's really hard for them to begin to recognise sensations that other people are recognising and adapting to really easily, and that this child's feeling really uncomfortable. So this child may feel really uncomfortable, this child may not be getting enough stimulation, and interestingly, people can move between the two as well.
Okay, so the first of the 5 senses you will be really aware of. Okay, so we have our sight, our visual processing. This comes from the retina, which is a tiny bit inside of your eye, and that switches on when lights come on. It gives loads of information to our brain about what's around us, what we can see, people, objects. It also helps us to see the boundaries of things, so stops us walking into anything. It's also really, really closely linked to our balance.
A number of the children that I've worked with have been able to tell me about sight difficulties. So one little boy would say it was really sore on his eyes when he went out in the car, and then I could see him in the class when the projector went on. That was really difficult for him, and even though he could visually tell me about what he could see on the book, his eyes were hurting because of the sensations of sight going in. So things like glasses and shades in the car can be really helpful for that. Equally, a girl that I was working with told me that sometimes if people were wearing reflective clothing like jackets, that was really painful. She could see the light bouncing off them and that was really uncomfortable for her. So sight can be really uncomfortable for some children.
The second of our sensory systems is hearing, the auditory sense. This is your ear picking up sounds around you and helping your brain to process them. We can tell the difference between different levels of noise if our auditory system is working well. So for instance, I will be able to tell the difference between somebody shouting and somebody whispering. I might find really high-pitched noises really irritating, and I might find low noises really soothing, but I can tell the difference about them. I can also tell the difference of how far away they are. So for instance, crossing the road, I can hear if a car is coming.
Auditory, this can be a really big difficulty for children. When I was first working in the Highlands, the main calls that I got was about children not managing noise in school, not managing to cope. Some children can tell us about this and will tell us things like it felt like a knife was scraping through my ear, and that sounds really terrible and really difficult to deal with. Some children are not able to tell us about this, but we may be able to see that at certain times they become uncomfortable, cover their ears or try to find a quiet space, or may even, if they're feeling uncomfortable, show us by things like self-injury or reflecting in their behaviour because they're finding noises too uncomfortable. We tend to be very aware of noises being present because noises come and go. So we can see a reaction with noises because we can see what the child was like before the noise was there and after the noise, so that gives us a lot of information. Some children look like they are fine with noise. So one child that I seen in a canteen, I seen him sat with his peers, leaning forward, laughing, smiling, talking back to them. When I went to that child afterwards and asked him how he was feeling, he told me that he felt like he'd been punched in the face. That was really difficult, and myself and the school agreed that that was not a comfortable situation that the child could continue to tolerate, and therefore we needed to make some adaptations, some of which we will discuss later on.
Okay, so the third of the sensors is your olfactory system. This is about your smell. And you've got tiny little receptors up your nose, and these are best friends with the ones on your tongue, and they help you to register information about what's happening around you. So there could be good smells like flowers or a particular food that you like. For Fred, that would be a sausage roll. But it can also be really nasty smells like somebody's stinky armpits or their bad breath.
Smell can have a big impact for some children. For example, they may notice smells that we don't notice, such as the smell of Play-Doh or blue tack can be really difficult for some children. Also, the smells that people wear, like perfume and things, can be tricky. If a room's being painted, the impact of that smell of paint can last for longer and can be really distracting and uncomfortable. Equally, when children are not able to receive the information from smell, this can be difficult, particularly if they're also finding that there's other senses that they're not receiving information from. They may decide that they want to get some of that information and may seek that information out. Sometimes this can be smells that we generally really dislike, and it can even lead to some children handling their feces to try and get the same smell. And if that's what they're doing, we need to find other smells that are as strong, such as some soap with a strong smell, or a hand soap with some little bits in, so that they also get feedback from that to replace the smells. So sometimes people are trying to get extra smells in.
So your next sense is your taste sense. This is also known as gustatory. There are little receptors on the back of your tongue, and these are best friends with the ones in your nose. This system helps you to taste things and to tell the difference between different sorts of food. So it might be a sweet taste, a sour taste, a savoury taste, something really, really salty, or something spicy.
So in terms of taste and use of the mouth, some children are hypersensitive, so they may dislike the toothpaste, and so you can get some non-flavoured toothpastes and things. Also, they just may find some particular foods in the mouth may feel uncomfortable, so they may be picky about what they put in their mouth. As they're moving things around the mouth, they'll also be needing to use some of their other senses, such as knowing how to move their tongue when they can't see it, to move things around the mouth. Using the mouth for some children, if they're not getting enough input from their other senses, the mouth has lots and lots of senses. So we can understand while a child who's not getting a lot of senses in may begin to lick items or to chew items to get that extra information in.
The next one is your sense of touch, also known as tactile. So your skin is all over your body, and it's made up of all these different cells which are really sensitive to being touched. There are certain bits of your body that are far more sensitive. So things like your mouth, your hands, and if you want to use Fred's example, your private bits. They've got a lot more sensors in them, so they're a lot more sensitive. Your tactile sense gives you information about things around you, the feeling of things. So you can tell the difference between something, say for instance, like a brick, which is really, really hard, or something like a feather, which is really soft. It can give you a sense of sharp, like a knife, or it can give you a dull sense, such as a rolling pin. It also helps you to tell the difference between things that are hot and things that are cold.
So touch is one of our earliest sensations, and things like cuddling and holding are often comfortable for the majority of children. We may find that children who are hypersensitive to touch may find these same sensations difficult, which can be very difficult for both the mother and the child. So we might see them disliking being cuddled. We may also see them having a very strong response to activities such as having their nappy changed or their clothing changed. As people with tactile sensitivity develop, they may also find that wearing certain clothes is more uncomfortable for them. There's a number of children, it's quite frequent to hear of children with tactile sensitivity who will take their clothes off as soon as they're home from school because they have just not liked being in that clothing. So children who are hypo responsive to touch may not notice someone sitting next to them or pushing on them, and because they're not noticing touch so much, they may be too strong when they're doing touch themselves, so they may push at somebody or pinch too hard because they're not recognising and feeling touch. Touch is really important for giving us feedback to help protect ourselves and plays part in pain. So it's really disabling if you don't notice something that is likely to be painful and injure you.
The 5 senses we've just spoken about are ones that you'll be really familiar with. The next 2 are a little bit more complicated. So the first one we're going to discuss is the vestibular system, and this is around your balance. So the information is taken in by your ears, it's processed with information from your eyes as well, into your brain, and it helps you to keep yourself upright. It helps you to keep yourself balanced. So imagine you've just been on a roller coaster and it's been upside down. Your vestibular system will have been shaken up, so all of us can start to experience what it might be like to have a poor vestibular system. So it allows me to see where I am in space. It allows me to know that I'm moving or that I'm still. It allows me to process information about other people around me as well. How fast are they walking? Are they going to walk into me? Do I have time to cross the road because there's a car coming? These can be incredibly different tasks for somebody who's struggling with their vestibular system.
So when we talk about the vestibular system, this refers to the system that helps us keep balanced and also works closely with our eyes. So for children who are hypersensitive to balance, they may find things like going down a step difficult or a series of steps. And also these children may feel sickness similar to car sickness from something as simple as going on a swing or roundabout. The other thing about the vestibular system is the sensations impact on our sensory system for a long time after, for up to 8 hours. And a child could go and do some swinging in the morning and look quite happy doing that, but may have a reaction later on in the day. So we need to be careful and cautious of this with the children. And what we often try to do in some situations where we're doing input into the balance system is to combine it with heavy work, because that helps keep the system organised. But vestibular is a really good sensation for keeping us active because it has such a long-lasting effect. So some people will tell us if they cycle to work on the bike in the morning, that can help keep their sensory system going well until much later in the day. And that fits in with the theory of that sensation staying in our system for a long time. In terms of hyposensitivity, a child may be spinning a lot or swinging a lot, or trying to move quite a lot to keep the vestibular system going. In some cases, some adults with autism have told me that it's only when they've spun excessively that they've been able to feel what they would describe as centred. So that would be calm, organised and ready to take in information. So we need to see what's happening for each child. And remember, some children can become sick by this sensation, but for other children this can be helpful. So it's keeping a close monitoring for each individual.
The final sense we're going to talk about is about body awareness or proprioception. That's probably a word that you've not heard before, but it's incredibly important for all kids with any neurodevelopmental processing difficulty. So our muscles and joints give our brains information about how we move and when we move. So if you have poor proprioception, being able to feel where you are in your space is incredibly difficult. So if I was sat down, I would be able to feel my bum on the chair. I would be able to feel my feet on the floor. I'd probably be able to lean down and pick something out of my bag because I have really good proprioception. I don't need to be able to see it to understand it. I know how my body works. When your proprioception is not working, it's incredibly difficult to keep still. So I'm sure you've all got a child that you know that literally fidgets constantly. They can't keep still because they're constantly trying to get some pressure through their body in order to be able to feel concrete.
So children with proprioceptive problems could have real trouble when they need to do things using the hands that they can't see because they're not getting the feedback from the muscles and joints. So for example, this can involve wiping yourself after toileting because you can't see where your hands are. So that can be a real struggle for children with proprioception difficulties. A child that I seen with proprioceptive difficulties, He did not have the awareness of his body in space. So one thing that he would do when it was circle time and children were sitting on the floor, he would go and sit on top of somebody else and not really notice this so much. That was because he wasn't getting good feedback. He would also try to give himself extra feedback. And when it come to holding his pencil, because he wasn't getting good feedback, he would have to watch his pencil as he was writing, and he pressed really hard on his pencil, so his hands began to get sore. There was also a girl that I worked with who found it really hard to know where her body was in space. This was really difficult in terms of when she went to sleep, because she was always worried that she would fall out of bed because she didn't know where her body was in space. And in that instance, her parents got her a double bed so that she felt more secure.
Now we're going to start to think about how do we actually process this information. We're going to use Fred's favourite thing, which is a sausage roll, and think about the sense of smell, also related to the sense of taste. So what you first do is you register that something's out there. So say, for instance, you've walked into a bakery and your nose starts to twitch and you start to think, something smells. You then start to think, you start to orienteer that information and you start to think, oh, that's familiar. I know what that smell is. You then start to interpret that information. You start to then think, oh, that might be a sausage roll. That is my absolute favourite thing. You organise that information and start to think, that is something that I want. That is something that gives me great pleasure. You then execute that information by grabbing the sausage roll and stuffing it in your mouth. So that's how we start to register sensory information around us. So our sensory systems impact on everything that we do in a day-to-day basis. So if we think about a child that's on the spectrum, that's going to start to really influence what they're capable of doing. For instance, if we thought about their ability to learn within a classroom, if, say, for instance, there's a really high-pitched noise from a projector onto a whiteboard, that's going to influence how that child can learn. The next thing we start to think about is that we all have what we call arousal and attention levels. If something is happening in your sensory systems, say for instance, mum accidentally bought the wrong washing powder and your skin's on fire because you've got a really sensitive touch stimulus, then you're not going to be able to learn French that day. Kids on the spectrum also have incredible difficulties with social interaction. This can also be to do with sensory systems. Fred likes to use an example of really fancying a girl in his class, but actually she wears such strong perfume that he can't approach her. Something we all have to do on a daily basis is keep on task, whether that be at school or in our work lives. Keeping on task helps us to achieve things during the day. However, if you've got a really sensitive sensory system and the sun is blaring through the window and hurting your eyes, you're not going to be able to focus on what somebody wants you to do. The next one that we're going to talk about is language development, and this is linked to social interaction and to social communication. As these are two massive issues for children on the spectrum, the ability to develop different languages can be really tricky. So say for instance, you're struggling with your own language, then being expected to learn a foreign language can be incredibly difficult, and lots of children do choose to remove those subjects from their curriculum. Emotional stability is also incredibly important for all of us. If you're feeling overly emotional because of something that's happened in your day, that's also something sensory. So say, for instance, we think back to the proprioceptive system. If you're struggling to keep still, if you're struggling to manage your body, if a teacher then asks you a really tricky maths question, potentially you're not going to be able to answer it, even if you have the intellectual capacity. And this can really impact on children's ability to learn. The next thing we need to think about is our daily living skills. I'm sure most of us have come across children who really struggle with teeth cleaning, struggle having their hair brushed because their touch sensation is so overwhelmed that almost becomes painful. And the final thing we need to think about is cognition. Cognition is our ability to follow a set pattern of behaviour in order to do something. So say for instance, I need to get the number 12 bus home. And on a really good day, when my sensory systems are not overwhelmed, I'm absolutely capable of getting the number 12 bus home. However, if I've had a really difficult day and my sensory systems are utterly overwhelmed, getting on that bus might be something that I can't actually do on that day. Now I want to talk a little bit more about other things that may impact on people with autism, not specifically around their sensory systems, but about their whole ability to function. Some of these will apply to all of us, but some of them are very specific to certain children. So some children on the autistic spectrum also have what we call a learning disability or a global development delay. Some children on the spectrum also have what we call comorbid conditions, which are things like attention deficit disorder or dyspraxia. Illness affects all of us, whether we're on the autistic spectrum or not. So say, for instance, you wake up in the morning and you've got a headache, that's automatically going to make you feel different on that day. The time of day or the actual day might make us feel different. So a Monday morning can be more difficult than a Friday afternoon. The time of day can be tricky. Say for instance it's coming up to playtime and I've used every bit of capacity I've got. I might not be able to manage as well. Hunger and thirst affect loads of us. So whether you're coming up to lunchtime or you're coming up to tea time, that can take us away from our ability to cope, particularly if we suffer with low blood sugar. This can have a massive impact on not just our sensory systems, but our ability to manage ourselves. All of us will experience at some point in time being incredibly overtired. However, if you're processing information in the way of an autistic person, exhaustion is very, very common. This can have a massive impact on the children that we work with. So say, for instance, the end of the day, the end of the week, the end of the term, all have significant impact on the children that we know. What we call change and transition are also incredibly difficult. So this might be moving from one activity to another. It might be moving from one classroom to another if you're in senior school. All of these things can upset your sensory system and leave you feeling utterly overwhelmed. If you've had a previous negative experience in that environment that you're transitioning to, that makes it even more difficult to cope with. Then if you put all of those things together, that becomes an incredibly difficult day. So imagine it's the end of the Christmas term, everything's changing, nothing's the same, you're extremely tired, everybody else is incredibly hyper, so they're making a lot more noise. Your sensory systems are going to be utterly overwhelmed, and we certainly experience a lot of difficulties with children on the autistic spectrum at that time of year due to the changes and transitions in sensory information.
So we all have sensory systems and have different ways of responding. One way that sometimes people can categorise things is into a bystander, seeker, sensor and avoider. So a bystander often waits until they see something. So a bystander often will see what information comes to them. So a good friend for a bystander to have would be a seeker. And a seeker is aware that they need extra sensory input and starts to seek this out for themselves. And at one point I asked my colleagues around me a survey to try to see where each person was on bystander, seeker, avoider or sensor. As these were all people whose sensory system was working well, the results weren't extreme. However, the person who was mainly a seeker would do all sorts of things like put a perfume on at a particular time, which was partly to put the perfume on, but partly to give her own stimulus, chew gum at a certain time and things like that. A child who's a seeker may seek out extra input by pushing somebody in a line. If they've also got autism, they might not know that that's not socially appropriate to do. So they may push everybody in the line in order to get the sensory information they need. A bystander may need that sort of input, but almost wait to be stimulated by somebody else getting the same sort of input. An avoider really has some sensations that they don't like and they're really uncomfortable with. So for children, this could be things like hand painting could be extremely difficult and could make them feel so uncomfortable that they move away from the paint table when the paints come out. Somebody who is a sensor is very sensitive to the information around them. So one small change in a room may be noticed. For example, I had somebody who come in for a therapy session. I had the equipment laid out, and one day I forgot to put the ball in, and they immediately were like, looked around the room and was like, where is the ball? They may notice really small changes. So for example, that there's been a change in the toilet cleaner used in the school. They may notice this, whereas other people would not notice.
Okay, so when we start to think about how we process sensory information, those of us who are what we call neurotypical, so we don't have a neurodevelopmental disorder, we follow a straight road. We go from A to B. But for a child with any sort of neurodevelopmental issue, they are literally riding a mountain bike track through a forest, over bumps, over hills and over rocks. So the journey that they take from A to B is so much more complicated than what we take. Hence, they can then get what we call utterly overwhelmed. When we become utterly overwhelmed by something, what's going to happen is that we either melt down or shut down, also known as fight or flight. So if we're melting down, we're fighting, we're going into the system where we literally can't cope and we become utterly overwhelmed and everything has to come out. So imagine shaking a Coke bottle and then releasing the lids. That's a child having a meltdown or going into the fight response. On the other end of that system, we can go into something called shutdown or flight, where we just can't cope, we don't know how to manage ourselves, and we literally have to shut ourselves down and remove ourselves from everything that's happening around us. Right, so now we're going to think about a few case studies. And the first one is Fred, my good old imaginary friend, the sausage roll eater. Okay, so Fred gets utterly overwhelmed by noise. So in the car, his mum's noticed that he really can't cope with the radio on, particularly if he's moving from one area to another. So say, for instance, you're on the way to school, which is an anxiety raiser for Fred. Having the music on is going to raise his anxiety even more. Mum's noticed that actually travelling in silence helps Fred to moderate his behaviour far more than he would be able to normally. His teacher at school has also noticed that the dining hall creates a lot of problems for Fred. These issues relate to Fred's auditory system, to his gustatory system, and also to his sense of smell. Being in that environment is utterly overwhelming for Fred because there's so much going on. There's so much noise, there's so much smell, there's so much clattering around him and chatting from other children. So what the school have arranged is for Fred to be able to spend some time out of the dining hall with a small group of friends in a quiet room. Fred is then much more able to moderate his behaviour in the afternoon because he's not had to cope with all of the sensory overwhelming information at lunchtime. This has ensured that Fred is actually able to concentrate in the afternoon lessons, which is incredibly important. The next child I want to tell you about is a girl called Steph. Steph has significant issues with her vestibular system and her balance and around her proprioception. What a dad has noticed is that if you're in a big crowd of people, Steph really struggles to be able to walk in a straight line. She's the kid that constantly walks in front of you, bangs into things. He's noticed that if he just links arm with Steph, then she can then walk in a straight line because it helps her to feel more balanced. This has also been apparent in school because the teachers have noticed that she's got a real inability to sit still, particularly when she's getting tired and a little bit overwhelmed. So what we put in place for Steph was a full programme of proprioceptive exercises that she breaks up and does during the day. This helps her to feel a lot more concrete, improves her proprioception and helps her to be able to concentrate in the lessons. The third and final child I want to tell you about is a boy called George. So George is sensory systems that are completely overwhelmed, or his sense of smell. This kid literally has the nose of a fox. He can smell everything from absolutely miles away. Particularly has an issue with coffee. It's a smell that he really can't cope with. So the staff that work with George suck a huge amount of mints, particularly after coffee break. He also has real struggles with the smell of different teachers. One teacher in particular wears a huge amount of perfume. Another teacher who does gardening with George at the end of that session can have a bit of a sweaty armpit issue. This is something that George can't cope with, and because George doesn't have a very good filter due to his autism, he will tell you that he can't cope with these issues. So we just need to ensure that we're moderating everything when we're working with George, that we're not wearing too much perfume, that we've made sure we've got plenty of deodorant on so that he doesn't become overstimulated. We've also encouraged him to carry a hanky in his pocket that's got some lemon essential oil on it, because that's a smell he really, really likes. So that when he is feeling that he's becoming overwhelmed by a smell that we can't control, he's able to get that out of his pocket and use it to be able to calm himself down. We're also using social stories with George to help him to think about the things that he says and does around people, as it can be quite offensive when you're told that you stink. Whilst we appreciate that, because we work with children with autism all of the time, we need George to be able to understand that that's not something that's socially acceptable. So now we're going to start to think about, what are we going to do to help this child? We've thought about what the sensory systems are, but now we need to get down into the nitty-gritty. What we need to remember at this point is that this is not every child. And this might be that on one day that child does have an issue with sensory overstimulation. On another day they might not have an issue with sensory overstimulation. So what you've got to bear in mind with everything that I say is that this is one child on one day, and it will differ from day to day. What you will see with the children that you parent or the children that you work with is that there are certain patterns to their behaviour that do follow the same lines. So how am I going to know that a child has a visual hypersensitivity? The sorts of things they might do is that they might start to shield their eyes from bright lights. They might want to start to look down if they're under fluorescent lighting. They might avoid eye contact. They might not cope with huge chunks of visual information. So say, for instance, you're putting information onto a whiteboard within a classroom. If there's too much visual information on that whiteboard, that child is not going to cope. I also find that in primary classrooms, because the teachers have tried to make that classroom incredibly visually stimulating for the rest of the children, that can be utterly overwhelming for the autistic child. They might get bothered by some colours or some patterns, such as Granny's wallpaper. I can remember walking into somebody's house at one point and the wallpaper was literally swirling out of the wall at me. For somebody with visual hypersensitivity, that's going to be incredibly difficult. They might also struggle if things are incredibly cluttered around them. So bedrooms that are full of toys, things that are utterly overwhelming. They might also struggle with flashing lights, so that maybe the kid that doesn't want to go to the school disco, and they may get lost really easily, even in places that they know well, such as a school that they've attended for a number of years. Okay, so how am I going to help that child? There are certain just really practical everyday things that I can do to support that child. If I know I'm taking that child, say, out into the playgrounds and it's a particularly sunny day, I could just hand that child a pair of sunglasses or a baseball cap. If I'm going into somewhere that I know has got really bright fluorescent lighting, again, I'm going to give them a baseball cap. If I'm giving them loads of visual information, I may use a frame that's cut out so that they can break that section down into much smaller sections. I'm not going to sit that child by a window or looking directly out of the window because the sun might be too bright. I'm going to use incredibly neutral colours on the walls for that child, particularly in things like bedrooms, because overstimulation in an evening can affect my ability to sleep. I'm going to help them to organise their desk or their drawers so that things are really easy to find for them. I might put visual clues onto the drawers of, say, pants and socks so that they're able to follow those systems. And you know what? I'm going to allow them to close their eyes if that's something that they need to do. Kids can get really visually overstimulated. So say, for instance, you're in a classroom and you need them to take in the oral information that you're giving. That child might actually need to have their eyes closed whilst they're doing that. And we need to understand that and to accept it. So now we're going to talk about visual hyposensitivity. So this is the child who's not getting enough information regarding their visual processing systems. So this child might stare at objects or at people. To its nth degree with this, you even occasionally come across people who are what we call face blind, in that they can't recognise people. They might like looking at the bright lights. They may even like looking at the sun. They might like to flick things in front of their eyes to get that visual stimulation. They might like to look at their own reflection. They might like to feel the edges of things, looking for the boundaries. So it's almost like this child has a visual impairment even when they don't, because they're constantly looking for reassurance around them. This child might struggle with steps or with curbs when they're walking around, because it's the difficulty of knowing where things start and stop. This child's potentially got really poor handwriting and they might struggle to stay on the lines. They might also struggle to take information down from a whiteboard. So how can you help this child? This child needs quite a bright, colourful room. And I appreciate that as a teacher, you can't meet the needs of this child and also the child who's visually hypersensitive. So it's about finding a happy medium. This child's going to need visual timetables and visual clues around what they need to do next. It might be worth photocopying handouts onto brightly coloured paper for this child, or using a brightly coloured acetate or an overlay. For things that you really need this child to take on board, you might want to use a highlighter pen. You might want to label drawers for this child. You might want to give them a coloured map of the school. Some of the new school builds in Highland are superb at having colour-coded corridors. What you could also do for that child is, say for instance the maths corridor is red, is that you then give them a red folder or a red file in order that they can then make that connection to that everything to do with maths is red. You might also need to wear quite brightly coloured clothing for that child so that they can recognise you as somebody that is familiar.
Changes in making visuals more organised can help both for children with visual hyper and hyposensitivity. For those that are getting too much and too little information, it can be really helpful to organise things. And so here's an example for somebody who was getting too little visual information and was not able to find her belongings. So we've put on extra items on her pencil, and a grip and a chewy at the end, and highlighters, and we put it in a see-through pencil case so that she can see where all her items were. Now for somebody who was getting too much visual stimulation, these items themselves might be too stimulating, so in that case we'll keep it organised but not necessarily in a see-through pencil case. Sometimes using the visual sense can also help to calm children down, as well as encouraging the sensory system. So we can use games such as Dobble, which is a visual matching game. So it could be used as a calmer for some children. Equally, it can be used to help children who are not noticing things visually to be stimulated to better notice things visually around them. Additionally, another sort of visual calmer can be something as simple as glitter in a bottle and watching this settle. This can be calming for some children. Also, the environment around them needs to be well organised, and some compromises on this can be having one wall with visual stimulus in and having another without visual stimulus. In terms of visual stimulus and organisation, it can be really helpful to involve autistic children with this to help them get used to any changes that you're planning.
So how would you know if a child had got an auditory hypersensitivity? Okay, so this is the child that really dislikes loud noise. They might put their hands over their ears. They might get really easily distracted with noise around them in the classroom. They may be the kid that hums or sings or make random noises just in their day-to-day life because they're trying to give themselves some way of coping with that noise, because noise that you can control is much easier than noise that you can't control. This child might hate having their hair cut as the snipping is too loud. They might wake up really frequently because they're very easily disturbed, and they may startle really easily if somebody does something in a sudden movement or a sudden noise. How can you help this child? Okay, so this child needs a quiet space in which to work. If that's not available, lots of kids will happily work with headphones on that have got quiet music playing through them so that they can block out the unpredictable noise around them and replace it with something that's really predictable. So for this child, you might use what we call a white noise maker or a radio on really low, as actually having a background predictable noise makes life much more manageable. Giving warnings for loud noise such as alarms is really important for this child, and keeping your vocal tone even is incredibly important, because if they hear something that changes in tone, they really struggle with it. Okay, so the next thing we need to think about is auditory hyposensitivity. So this is the child who's not getting enough information. They might not respond to their name. They might find it really difficult to follow the instructions of a class teacher because they're ignoring the sounds around them. They're just not picking up on them. This child often gets labelled as being quite ignorant because they're ignoring people, but it's just that they don't have the ability to process that information. This is a child who might make a lot of noise themselves. They might be walking around banging stuff because to them that doesn't sound loud. They may be not great at pronunciation when they're reading aloud, and they may enjoy really noisy areas such as kitchens. So how can you help this child? This child needs quite a loud, quite a bubbly and lively teacher. They're not going to respond to somebody who's quite quiet and quite calm because they're going to struggle to pick up on the messages that person is giving. They're going to like upbeat music, and this is going to keep them happy. You might need to use an alarm on a watch to remind them to do things. You could give auditory cues such as a bell or a clap in order to get that attention. You might find that allowing this child to hum or sing or listen to music really helps them to concentrate. This child likes noise. This child is going to be the first one in the queue for the school disco because they're going to find that level of noise really motivating.
In terms of sound sensitivity, this can be really difficult for some children, and so we need to also think about how we can build up their tolerance of sound. So one nice way is to give it a structure. So the structure could be something like playing sound lotto. Equally, you could have a sound tin and you could put lots of different things, items in the tin. In terms of helping children with sensory problems, it can be really helpful to give them a lot of control over that sensation. So if we did have a sound tin, we might put something like spaghetti in that made a sound. If a child can make and control that sound themselves, that can help them get ready for it. In addition to things like this, when the school bell goes off, some children have benefited from going along and putting the school bell on themselves so that they can see how it works, and understanding why something makes such a loud noise is also helpful for children. So also listening to noise overnight has been beneficial for some children. And so I'm going to show you a sound machine that some children do use overnight. So it's got different sounds and you can change the sound. So So there's a nice range of sounds and there's different sound boxes. This sound box is available to lend from the Pines Library. So this box we can lend from the Pines Library. With these, some people have them overnight. So I'd recommend with autistic children, first of all, getting them used to a sound and checking that is something that they like. It works for some people, and some people have found it highly beneficial to help with their sound sensitivity overnight. We find people find different ways of doing these themselves, such as having a fan on all night, but that can be dangerous if the fan overheats, and people say it's used up a lot of electricity in comparison to these. So it's worth considering these sound boxes if your child has sound sensitivity.
The next sense we're going to discuss is the olfactory sense of smell. And we're going to think about that in relation to hypersensitivity. So remember the example we used of George, who can literally smell everything, even from 10 foot away. These are children like George, who can literally smell everything, and everything becomes utterly overwhelming. So this child is going to really struggle with places that are really smelly. So places like public toilets, going into places that have very strong smells, such as a perfume department in a department store. Things that smell really normal to us can smell utterly overwhelming to them. So I remember many years ago working with a child called John, whose family could never have a Chinese takeaway because the smell of the spices within the Chinese literally felt like they were burning for John. So how am I going to be able to help this child? So I need to identify smells that this child really does like. So I'm going to give them something that replaces that smell, something that is powerful and calming for them. I'm going to really avoid the use of scent around them. So I might need to think about non-scented shower gel, about non-scented washing powder. I'm going to need to talk with the adults around them, ensure that they're not wearing strong perfumes. And I'm going to offer that child food that doesn't have really strong smells, as that could be utterly overwhelming and make it that that child cannot actually eat that meal. On the flip side of that, we then have children that have a very limited sense of smell. So they are hyposensitive to smell. So they're going to have really little recognition to smells. They might be the child that spends their entire day in your class trumping because they can't smell it. They like to try and smell things, including complete strangers. So you might have a child that walks up to you and gives you a good sniff. They might like really strong smells such as glue or perfume. And they might like their own smell. I have in the past worked with people who rub their own armpits and sniff their fingers and even more delicate parts. So how am I going to help that child? This child has got a really limited sense of smell. So say, for instance, within your school, within your home, you need to ensure that your smoke detectors are working, because this child is not going to smell if there's a fire. You need to be really consistent in what smells are happening around them every day. So if I'm working with a child like this, I need to ensure that I'm wearing the same perfume every day, because by changing it could be incredibly confusing, particularly if that child has a learning disability. I'm going to make sure that smelly things are available to them when they're stressed. So I'm going to let them have access to bottles or hankies or things that have got maybe essential oils on them, that gives them that sense of something that is incredibly calming and really quite pleasurable.
In terms of smell, there's things that we can do to avoid the child being confronted by that smell. So for example, with things like kitchen cleaners and things that might have a strong smell, you might decide that you'll clean the kitchen at a time when the child's away and have time for that smell to fade. Equally, you might have to look for cleaning products that are not going to carry so much smell. So that can be important. Things like coffee and things. So some people don't like the smell of that coffee, and therefore we may need to avoid that coffee smell. If somebody doesn't like that. Now, for some children who are hyposensitive to smell, we may like to encourage them to have a smell of the things that we're using every day, and I'd say do this in really small amounts, because smell is the sense that is most connected to our brain and brings up, it travels quickest through our brain. it's chemicals. And it's also really related to our memory and our emotions. So if we were to stimulate somebody's smell sense, I would stick to using everyday things that they're likely to be exposed to anyway, and do them in really small amounts. So it could be just having a little smell of the coffee as we're taking it out. So we could do something like, how does it look? How does it smell? How does it taste? We could do that with items and set up that sort of structure that can be helpful for children who are not receiving all the information around them. Equally, we can decide on what sort of smells of soap we'd have. So for somebody who was very sensitive, we might be looking for an odourless soap. And for somebody who was very hyposensitive, we might want one with a strong smell. And there may be times when that changes for the individual child. So you might want 2 bottles and to swap them round at certain times.
The next sense that we're going to think about is our gustatory sense. And that's thinking about that hypersensitivity child first. So how are we going to know that this child's got an issue? This child's likely to be a really picky eater. They might gag when they eat, and they might not like strong tastes. They might not like complex textures, and they might not like extreme temperatures such as ice cream. They may prefer water over any other drink, and they are the child that probably doesn't like the strong smells as well, because these 2 senses are really closely linked. So how can I help this child? I might let this child chew gum because they've got a need to be doing something with their mouths. I might allow this child to eat that very, very picky diet they've got. We sometimes call this the beige diet because they will choose really, really simple, plain, basic foods. Things like toast, cereal, chips, because they know that these things don't have strong tastes. I'm probably going to give this child a packed lunch because it's highly unlikely that they're going to be able to eat in the canteen at school. I might need to introduce new foods really slowly to this child, and they may prefer their food to be in separate piles. So this is probably not a child who's going to like something like a shepherd's pie where everything is mixed together. They might like little individual piles of, say, chicken nuggets, potato, peas, where everything is separate. On the flip side of the child who's hypersensitive to taste, we have the child who's hyposensitive. This child will literally eat anything that's left out. This is a condition known as pica, and people will put really inappropriate things in their mouth. Sometimes pregnant women experience this when they have a craving to eat something that's inappropriate, such as coal. It's not unknown for us to work with children who have this desire to literally eat anything. This child might also have a difficulty with overfilling their mouth because they can't feel the full sensation within their mouth. There may be a child that drools and dribbles. This child may bite their nails or chew on their fingers. They might like hot and spicy food or things that are incredibly crunchy. They're also likely to like salty or sour food because they don't notice the strong smells. How can I help this child? So I'm going to give them things that are really stimulating for them. I might allow them to chew or suck on really strong flavours. When cleaning their teeth, I'm going to give them a vibrating toothbrush so that they can feel the sensations much more strongly. I might give them chewy objects to stop them chewing everything else. I'm sure we've all come across a child who chews the sleeves of their jumper or chews the cords on their hoodie. This is something that gives them real pleasure and actually helps them to feel settled. But obviously I don't want them chewing all of their clothing, so I'm going to give them something more appropriate. I might give this child really spicy foods, and I'm also going to give them a bottle that's got a really strong sucker or a straw, because that sensation of having to suck, say for instance, a really thick milkshake through a straw, is really regulating for this child and gives them great pleasure.
Taste and smell go together. So before you put something in your mouth, you're going to be smelling how it is before you're ready to taste it. So it can be important that that smells okay for you. You can get toothpaste that doesn't have any smell, and doesn't have any taste. And for some children who are hypersensitive, that can be really helpful. For other children, they will be looking for stronger smells and things. So the toothbrushes, some children find it very difficult to have a toothbrush in their mouth. They may be feeling that that's too sensitive, and so things like a silk toothbrush can help. Equally, many parents have reported that they found a 3-headed toothbrush helps. So it gets them to do part of the teeth brushing in less time with these things, so that the time that the child is feeling uncomfortable is reduced. Additionally, in terms of being able to move your toothbrush around your mouth, the model can be useful for this. If children can't feel what's happening inside the mouth and what's happening with the tongue and things, they may need to practice first to get to know the way around the mouth, and that can be really helpful in encouraging children to brush their teeth. Equally, taste can bring difficulties with the food that children will eat. So somebody who is very sensitive to food may dislike a lot of strong tastes, and they'll be veering towards less strong tastes. So one way to help with this is to put out small amounts of the food for them to smell first, and maybe have the option of tasting, just as an experience. So making it less and having a small smell of it, even that small smell can be a helpful thing to try for somebody who's very adverse to food tastes. Another thing that can be helpful in terms of if children don't like taste is grading. Where do you feel on 1 to 10 scale this is? Additionally, for children who are not getting all the information that they need about taste, spicy foods and things, it possibly could also be useful to have different foods together to smell, to look at, to taste. And when we're thinking about taste, we can think about the mouth itself. So the mouth gets feedback. The part of our body that is really the most proprioceptive part is our tongue, because we can't see our tongue moving around. Therefore, some children want to get extra input into the mouths, and they may seek that by chewing, and things like chewy tubes can help. Also, it's useful to find out if a child can suck and blow. Adults, when they're regulating their sensory system, will often be asked to breathe slowly, breathe in, breathe out. This can be a bit of a tricky thing to ask a child. So a more concrete thing to ask them might be to blow. And it can be really useful for children to ensure that children are learning to suck and blow, because it doesn't come easily for everyone. But that can be a nice way of having an impact and calming our sensory system. So blowing in and out of a paper bag can be really helpful. Blow football, blowing bubbles in a glass, they can all be really helpful and organising for children.
Thinking of the fifth sense then is touch. This is thinking about the child that is very hypersensitive to touch. So this is a child who doesn't like people touching them. They don't want you to hug them. They don't want you to pat their backs. They might overreact to very accidental touch. If somebody brushes against this child, they may feel like they're being hit. This child avoids things that are really dirty and messy. So say, for instance, finger painting in nursery. This child may be what we call a tippy-toe walker. They may also dislike crowds and queues, and they may dislike changes in temperature from very hot to very cold. They may absolutely hate getting washed, having their hair cut, having their nails trimmed, or cleaning their teeth, because it feels utterly overwhelming to this child. So how am I going to help this child? I'm going to think about how I can give this child what's called firm, deep pressure. I might look into what's called a sensory diet to be able to give this child some movement that does feel good, some pressure that does feel good. I'm going to sit this child at the back of the class so that they don't constantly get bumped into by every other child moving around the room. I might give this child tight clothing to wear, such as something with lycra in it, because again, it's giving them some touch that's predictable and safe. I might help this child to not have to change their clothing during other sessions, such as a PE lesson, because actually taking off one t-shirt to replace it with another might be massively overstimulating. So we might just have to accept that that child cannot get changed. I might give this child something heavy or weighted to wear because it allows them to feel safer. And I might give this child a very heavy quilt or a blanket on its bed to allow it to feel some touch and some tactile stimulation that is not threatening. At the opposite end of the spectrum, from somebody who's hypersensitive to touch, is somebody that's hyposensitive. This child loves rough and tumble. This child is constantly bumping and bouncing off of other kids in the classroom. This is the child that's absolutely covered in cuts and bruises and that they've got no awareness of how they got them. This child has no awareness of the temperature of water, so could easily get scalded. This is a child who maybe needs to see something as a concrete being and actually be able to touch it and manipulate it to know what it really is. This child might not know that they're being touched. So this child can easily get injured because they're not aware of pain sometimes. This is a child who picks at scabs and nails, and they might also have a pretty snotty nose or a dribbly mouth because they're completely unaware of it. So where we would be able to feel that a nose is running, they're not conscious of it at all. So how can I help this child? This child wants to rough play. This child wants to move. So I'm going to ensure that this child has lots of that stimulus within its day. I might get this child fidget toys so it's got something on its table that it can do all of the time, because if they don't have that, they're going to struggle to concentrate. I'm going to have to keep a really close eye on the temperature of water, say for instance in the toilets that they use, because they could very easily become burnt. This is also a child that in a home economics lesson I'm going to have to keep a really close eye on. I'm going to give them loose fitting clothing to wear, and I'm going to get them doing lots of movements such as dancing or sport. This child's probably going to thrive from a PE lesson. So say for instance, if I've had that opportunity to do lots of movement, I'm then going to be able to concentrate a lot better. This child will potentially benefit from having an animal in its home or in its school environment. If that's not feasible, there are lots of fabrics that we can give a child that can give a similar sort of sensation. We can also give them things like stress balls or Play-Doh. We might get them kneading bread. These things will all be hugely beneficial to this child who's got tactile hypersensitivity.
Fidget items are really helpful for some children. They can just fidget about with them, help them to be calm and help give them some input. This can be helpful for children who are seeking out input, and it's really important to consider how fidget items are used. And so when given a fidget item, you may say, this is to help you concentrate, this is the way that you use it, and then you have somewhere to put it away as well. Just because a child's not looking as they're holding a fidget item doesn't mean they're not taking in information. They can be helpful. Even things as simple as an elastic band to play with can help somebody keep focused. And we just need clear rules with these. Somebody who talked about ADHD once was talking about children, they call these concentrators rather than fidget items. With the thing is that children do need these, and sometimes it's tempting to take a concentrator away from a child, but we could consider alongside that, would we ever take a pencil away from a child if they misused it? Probably not, because they need it to write. Equally, probably they may need their concentrator to help them learn. It can be, some children put them in bags, bum bags, with different items in that they can pull out, or you can build them into social stories for when doing activities. Bubble wrap can be used to just get some squashing, popping even as something to twist. Finding what's individual and works for each child is really important. So our tactile system is one of the first systems to develop. Getting the tactile system organised is really helpful. It's one of the main senses that has an impact on all the other senses. If you're feeling uncomfortable in how your skin's feeling, it has an impact for lots and lots of things. So one thing that we often suggest to parents is building in some activities into their everyday things. For example, a really nice activity to stimulate the tactile system in a predictable way is to give firm, heavy towel rubs as somebody's coming out of the bath. So if you go firmly down people's arms when you're towel rubbing them, maybe do it more than once, and have nice firm pressure. This is sending good predictable information to the skin, and it's also helping develop the skin system at the same time. Additionally, there are other activities that you can do to stimulate the tactile system. So some children will be wanting to get lots of tactile information in, and that can be really helpful. And some children are going to need to be helped to start to take in their tactile information. So for both these types of children, getting spaghetti and cooking spaghetti and making it nice and soft can make a nice activity where the child who really wants that can get that need met by seeking, maybe hiding things in the spaghetti for them to find. And the child who's not really taking in information can have the opportunity to be prompted to try to handle that spaghetti if they're not liking it. One of the really important things about all our senses is that the child is best when they have a sense of control about touching things. If you don't like touching something and somebody tries to do that, to get you to touch something, it can be really uncomfortable. So we'd go to more modelling things and inviting things. So if a child didn't like having paint on near them and was really scared of that, we wouldn't say put your hand in the paint. What we would do is to start that painting activity, maybe a little bit away from them, let them see it and give them chances to model, so to see that and model some of it. Sometimes children will like to get the paint and put it on your hands before they're ready to have it on their hands. So the sense of control is really important. Sometimes tactile things can be tied to other activities. So we could do some feeling of this hair, of this teddy, but also they could do some brushing of the hair, some cutting of the hair to get them used to the tactile sense, but also to the processes involved in everyday things. Additionally, we could set up a feely box, so put lots of different feels in a box and get the child to open that box and have a look through, maybe keep the ones in that they really like and rotate the others. So it could have things like brushes in, so the child could give input into their own skin. And sometimes it's really nice to see what children will decide to do with these. And they can do things that are nice and calming for themselves. Also soft things to feel. So one child would really like this and another child may really hate this. If I get this out and somebody shows a really adverse reaction to it, I may decide that I'd take it away, sometimes even put it outside the door, depending on how much of a problem that is causing for that child. And I might get them to tell me from a 1 to 10 scale how they felt about that. But some children really like it and some children really don't. And so it's getting the things that they don't like, keep bringing in, but maybe smaller and for less time.
So the next thing we're going to think about is vestibular or balance hypersensitivity. How would I know that a child has got this problem? This is a child who absolutely hates being upside down. So getting them to do something like gymnastics is absolutely off the cards. This child likes to have their feet firmly on the ground. They're not going to like things like swings. They may feel really dizzy or sick frequently. So this is a child who may really struggle with being in a car for a long period of time. This child bumps into stuff a lot. They've probably got pretty poor balance and they may be absolutely rubbish on a bike. They might find it hard to settle into a movement activity such as PE. So how am I going to help them? What am I going to do that's going to make life easier? I'm going to allow them to move at their pace. I'm not going to encourage them to do things like handstands or cartwheels. This is something that's going to be really not within this child's capability. I might encourage things like swimming or walking. They're good, solid exercises. I could use some firm touch and deep pressure with this child. I'm definitely not going to encourage this child to go on a lift or an escalator because this is going to make their balance 10 times worse. I'm also not going to get them to do lots of exercise that has them bending over frequently, as that's going to make them feel incredibly sick. I'm allowing them to find something that's comfortable for them. So within a classroom setting, I'm going to allow this child to find a really comfortable position at their table in which to work. That may mean that that child needs to hold their head and have their elbow very firmly planted on the table in order that they can feel very safe and very secure. At the opposite end of the scale to the child who's got vestibular hypersensitivity, we have the child who's hyposensitive in their balance. So how am I going to recognise this child? This child probably does a lot of rocking, a lot of bouncing, a lot of fidgeting. This child probably loves things like swings and roundabouts. They're probably the risk taker. They're constantly climbing and jumping over things. They might be bouncy, wobbly people who've got really low muscle tone, and they may slump a lot in their chairs and over their desks. How am I going to help this child? I'm going to get this child doing as much movement as possible, particularly things that bounce and spin. I'm going to make them do really big movements before I get them doing something that's fine motor. So say, for instance, I need this child to write with a pencil. I might need to get them to do something like star jumps first in order that if I've increased that sensitivity, that they can then do something that's fine motor. I'm going to teach this child gymnastics. I'm going to send this child to the gymnastics class or parkour. I might potentially give this child a bouncing ball to sit on, such as an exercise ball, because having that level of movement and improving their core muscles can really help them to concentrate. I might let them sit on an office chair at different periods during the day so that they can spin round and round and round because they find that really stimulating. I'm also going to get this child to maybe touch their toes on a regular basis to again increase their sense of balance.
So in terms of vestibular activities, it can be important to build up skills, particularly for children who are very sensitive to vestibular activities. This things like spending some time possibly standing at first and then maybe sitting on a wobble cushion can be helpful. I try to get it to be on the child's terms. So if I introduce something like this, even though this is designed to sit on a chair and people to wobble on, and is generally used in that way for children who need extra vestibular input, we can also use it with a child who is sensitive to vestibular input. But I would definitely give them this to handle and ask them, can they think of ways of using it, so that they're sort of in charge of how they explore it. They might stand on it, they might sit on it. So it's giving them some control as we're doing it. Other vestibular activities can be practicing balancing on one leg and things like that. Using a swing. A really helpful activity for children who are sensitive to vestibular things is getting them to build up an obstacle course and go over and under things, because that takes up a lot of vestibular things, but they can control it by setting out the obstacle course.
Proprioceptive dysfunction is something I'm absolutely passionate about because I see loads of children with these issues, particularly in classrooms. And if we can start to alleviate some of the problems that they're experiencing, their anxiety goes down dramatically and their ability to function goes up. So how would I know if somebody was struggling with their proprioceptive sense? This is a child who cannot sit still. They are constantly on the go. They are constantly fidgeting and bouncing and moving and slapping and tapping. They may be the child that gets under the table and wants to hide in a small space. They may be a child that's biting themselves or banging their heads because they're trying to get some concrete feeling through their systems. They often flop against people or are completely unaware of other people's personal space. They want to be cuddled up against you. They feel that is very regulating for them. The child with proprioceptive difficulties sometimes has a need to be incredibly close to either an object or a person because that helps them to feel a lot more concrete. This is the child that if you sat on the settee with them, they are scrunched up against you or climbing on top of you. Things like fastening buttons or doing up zips may be incredibly tricky for this kid. Proprioceptive difficulties can also be linked to something that we call interoceptive difficulties. And this means that they're also not feeling the internal feelings as a concrete thing either. So if you imagine that when you are hungry, you can feel that as a sensation. When you need to go to the toilet, you can feel that your bladder is full. This can be incredibly difficult for people on the autistic spectrum who have these difficulties. And we often know that with children who are very difficult to toilet train or never seem to be full or have a constant need to be drinking or eating. So how am I going to help this child? I am going to get this child doing as much deep pressure, heavy work as I can feasibly get. I'm going to get them putting major movements through their major joints. So thinking about things like ankles, knees, hips and shoulders. I'm going to get them carrying really heavy things. I'm going to get them moving furniture. I'm going to get them vigorously bouncing on an exercise ball or on a trampoline. I might do things like deep hand and foot massage with them, or I might get them swimming or cycling, as this puts a huge amount of movement and pressure through those joint systems and makes you feel a lot more concrete. Other things that I might get them to do, depending on the level and ability of that child, is that I might get them mowing the lawn. I might get them chopping wood, obviously with supervision. I might get them into racket sports such as tennis or things like basketball where you're putting a lot of weight through a very heavy, very hard ball. Tug of war exercises can be really beneficial for these children, as can running up and down the stairs because it's putting a lot of movement through your hips. Wearing ankle and wrist weights is an option for some children, as is wearing tight clothes, including squeeze vests or just something that's lycra in nature. Doing woodwork, kneading bread, anything that's giving me really good proprioceptive movement and helping my body to feel more concrete. When my body feels more concrete, I feel calmer. I have issues with this myself. If I've had a particularly bad day, the thing that I find really helps when I get in from work is putting my dressing gown on and tying it really tightly, because the weight and the pressure just helps my system to balance back out. So instead of feeling like a fizzy bottle of Coke, I feel much calmer.
Proprioceptive, heavy work activities are helpful for lots of children. They help the children who are very sensitive, and they help the children who are hyposensitive and not noticing things. So they can be a really useful activity. Some things like using a heavy ball for Skittles, and you could make your own Skittles by filling up plastic bottles and things. That then involves, if you filled them with water, means that you'd have heavy work to move the bottles around. These heavy balls are available to lend from the Pines. Equally, some children would benefit from using something, they can benefit from being involved in recycling. So another heavy work activity could be saving up your recycling bottles and getting children to squash them with their feet or their hands. If you've got like 10 of those to squash, then that's a lovely heavy work activity and feels very useful as well. This is called theraputty, and it's like Play-Doh, but it's got more resistance, so it's harder. So it gives lots more feedback to your muscles and joints, and it's picked purposefully because it gives that extra feedback. It can be really helpful to make things with this. Some children have wrote out words with it. Equally, it's really nice to hide things in it, and some children really love that. If you get 5 items and they hide it in and you look for it and then you swap over, they have to do lots of exploring and they get lots of work with their muscles and joints. Equally, things like clay can be helpful, and even more resistant is Filmo, where the child might be able to make something out of Filmo that then they can feel like they've made something to keep. Also, to give extra information to your muscles and joints, sometimes wearing lycra type clothing will give feedback. That can be really helpful. These are weighted lap cushions, which is basically, the property of this is that it's quite heavy. It's like a big beanbag. So some children like to sit with this on their knees, and that can help them know where they are in space, plus get extra proprioceptive information. You can get ones like this that are animals that are soft as well, that can go over your shoulders. But some children also like to stroke those, so they've got extra things that they can do to give them that extra sensory input that they need to keep them calm and organised. In terms of proprioceptive exercises, the bigger movements that we use, the more impact it's going to have on our sensory system. So we're trying to really get the muscles and joints working. So things like helping with shopping, taking shopping out and putting it on the counter, going up and down and putting it on repetitively can help. Standing on one leg, hopping, jumping, doing star jumps, press-ups against the wall, or even press-ups in your chair can be really helpful. The bigger the movement, the more impact it has on your muscle and joint system. This is a collective ball. It's got a number of handles, so we can get children to pull and pull quite strongly, and it can be quite fun. Equally, cheaper options are things like a towel for pulling, or a rope, even pushing each other's hands together in a game that we call push and pull, in which 2 people would get their hands and push them together through their shoulders and elbows for as long as they can. The rule on this game is always when one person says stop, you must stop, but that can be a really helpful game. As well as doing it with your hands, you can push with your backs and things like that.
I hope that you've enjoyed this film and getting to know Fred. I hope that you've taken on board that Fred says it's really not rocket science. This is everyday common sense, knowing your child or the child that you teach incredibly well and thinking about the practical activities that your child copes with or doesn't cope with. How can I give them the opposite sensation to the one that they're struggling with? How can I help for them to proactively manage what they can do and when they can do it? How do I start to recognise when my child has absolutely lost the ability to cope and I just allow them to take that time out?